It's great to have the privilege to speak again today. Appreciate Pastor Wayne and the team asking me. I first met Pam in September of 1999. She was a member of the congregation in Billings, Montana, where I was the executive pastor. Just before Thanksgiving in 1999, her 18-year-old middle son, Joshua, who was a freshman at Oral Roberts University, died tragically in a basketball accident as he reached up, grabbed the hoop. It shattered. He fell on his head. It was the third death in her family in less than 5 years. Her husband died of cancer in 1995. Her then oldest son, Nathan, died in 1997, also at age 18, from a congenital heart condition. And needless to say, it was a devastating time in her life. She had a youngest son, Andrew. He was 16 at the time. And a few months after Joshua's death, they came to see me, and you can imagine they had a ton of questions over what had happened. Perhaps the one that haunts me yet to this day was Andrew's question to me. He said, "Pastor Gary, am I next? I'm 16. Both of my brothers died at 18. Will I die when I'm 18? Today, as Pastor Aaron told us, we are continuing our series, Year of Favor. This is the 5th message in the series, emphasizing what does God's favor look like in situations and things we actually go through in life. Where was God's favor with Pam and Andrew and their situation? Our specific theme today is God's favor in the wilderness. Now, in our Bible, wilderness is literally just that. It refers to geographical areas that are not inhabited. And at the time our Bible was written in the Middle East, there were a lot of wilderness areas, and a lot of significant events in this book happen in the wilderness. Jesus was tempted by the devil at the beginning of his ministry in the wilderness. It was in the wilderness that God prepared Moses for 40 years to lead Israel out of bondage in Egypt. But wilderness is also a metaphor in our Bibles for the place where God often chooses to train his people. And that brings us to what we want to discuss today as we look at an event in the life of Old Testament Israel that occurred in the wilderness. The event we're going to look at today is probably not as well known as some of the other events that happened in the wilderness, but it's a very significant one because of the lessons that Israel learned during this particular phase in her history. Now, we do not really know when the events that we're going to read about today happened. Best guess is it was at least 1,400 years before Jesus Christ was born, but it could have been longer than that. Now, as I'm sure many of you know, Israel started as a small family unit from the family of Abraham. And when they were about 75 or so people big, there was a great famine in Israel, and they had to migrate to Egypt for food. And they ended up staying there 430 years for various reasons. And the last of those 430 years were incredibly difficult for them as a people group. They were oppressed. They had to undergo forced labor. And the king of Egypt, Pharaoh, was ruthless to them. He was threatened by them because they had grown in numbers, and he thought perhaps they were a security threat to Egypt. So he treated them very poorly. They cried out to God, begging for deliverance. God finally said, "Enough is enough with Israel's misery." And he sent Moses to confront Pharaoh, demanding Israel's release. Pharaoh said, "Yes, right, over my dead body." To which Moses responded, "Well, it can be arranged." And so we had the famous 10 plagues that we're familiar with, either from reading the book or seeing the movie. And the final plague was the one that broke, the straw that broke the camel's back, and Pharaoh finally said, enough, out of here. And so Israel hurried out. But there was a problem. All of her years in bondage, and particularly the final years, had taken its toll on them as a people. They were emotionally and psychologically and physically broken down. And they didn't have what it was going to take for them when they got back to Israel, to face enemies who had come and inhabited that land in their absence. As one scholar said, quote, "It's one thing to get Israel out of Egypt. It's another thing to get Egypt out of Israel." And so God had to work in their lives to get them prepared to go back home. Now, if I could be a professor for a moment, I want to show you a map here so we can get some context as to what is going on. I called my 7-year-old granddaughter yesterday and asked her how to use this iPad, so I think we'll be okay. Okay, wait. Oh, tap here, Grandpa. Okay, here we go. Oh, wait. There we go. So you can see here's Egypt. And here's where they left Egypt. And here's Israel. Now you can see, it doesn't take a rocket scientist to see, that the shortest way to get there is here, just on a journey under the Mediterranean Sea. Not a very long journey. But God said they're not ready. If they go here, they're going to encounter enemies and they're going to be slaughtered because they're just not prepared for it. So he said, my plan is to lead them south to a place called Mount Sinai, and I'm going to have them camp there for about a year, and I'm going to mature them. I'm going to get them healthy. And this Mount Sinai is where very famous events like the giving of the 10 Commandments happened, as he prepared Israel to then be able to go back home a mature and a strong people. Now, he actually began this maturation process while they were walking from here to here. It took about 50 days for them to walk there. And as they walked there, he had them stop 7 times. You can see places like Ramses, Sukkoth, Pihahiroth, Elam, places like that. They stopped 7 times. And every time they stopped, he taught them a significant life lesson that helped mature them, get them strong, able to face what was in front of them in life. And so this 50-day journey began the process of their healing and their restoration. And we are told in the New Testament that these things happened to Israel to serve as an example, and they were written down to instruct us. We are also told that we must in all things grow up into him who is the head, that is Christ. So the lessons that they learned when they stopped at each of those 7 places are lessons for us as well. Lessons that God wants to work in our lives so that we can be prepared to face what it is we're asked to face in life. I want to look at one of those lessons today. If you have your Bible, I invite you to open to Exodus chapter 15. What we're going to look at today is actually the 4th place they stopped. Remember, I told you they stopped 7 times. The one we're going to look at today is actually the 4th place they stopped. So they've already learned some lessons. As a matter of fact, they've already learned one of the most significant lessons they would learn, and that was at the events of the Red Sea, when, as we know, the sea opened and parted and they saw an incredible miracle as Pharaoh's army was drowned. They had already seen God working in a great way. This was stop number 4. But at the 4th stop, they encountered something they weren't ready for. And let's see what happened to them. Exodus chapter 15, verse 22. Then Moses led Israel from the Red Sea, and they went into the desert of Shur. For 3 days they traveled in the desert without finding water. When they came to Marah, that's the fourth stop, they could not drink its water because it was bitter. That's why the place is called Marah. So the people grumbled against Moses, saying, "What are we to drink?" Then Moses cried out to the Lord, and the Lord showed him a piece of wood. He threw it into the water, and the water became sweet. There the Lord issued a ruling and instruction for them and put them to the test. He said, "If you listen carefully to the Lord your God and do what is right in his eyes, if you pay attention to his commands and keep all his decrees, I will not bring on you any of the diseases I brought on the Egyptians, for I am the Lord who heals you." Now the lesson at the fourth stop is actually memorialized by the name of the place. Marah means bitter in Hebrew. Stopping there, coming there, I should say, must have been awful. Imagine the discomfort and desperation of traveling 3 days in a hot desert without finding water. Then you find water, and when you take a big gulp, you are hugely disappointed because it is not drinkable. When they came to Marah, they could not drink its water because it was bitter. Now here's the worst part about it. God led them there. It's like, seriously, Jesus? What are you thinking? Well, he was obviously thinking something, and we want to look this morning at what is it that he was thinking. Now, unfortunately, Marah is a fair representation of a part of life. On one hand, we all know life can be good. 1 Timothy says God richly provides us with everything for our enjoyment. So as believers, we want to enjoy life. We know there are good things in life. There are good times. Nature, art, music, family, a great glass of water. We want to enjoy life. If you don't enjoy life, well, we need to maybe do something about it. But Paul also tells us that the creation was subjected to frustration because of what happened with Adam and Eve. So life can also be frustrating, it can be bitter, and it can seem futile. Bitter experiences are destined as a part of the human situation. How long does it take, for example, for weeds to grow or the laundry to pile up? How about the first scratch on your new car? Or ladies, how about the first time you realize that your knight in shining armor rusts? How many days are stress-free in a hammock? Worse yet, death, disease, poverty. Bitter and disappointing experiences are a part of the human condition because, as the Bible tells us, God has not yet wiped away all tears. It is impossible, as everyone in this room knows, to live on a fallen planet and not be exposed to suffering and pain and disappointment and bitter realities, all of which are along the path of God's providential leading of our lives. Many of you are familiar of the book of Ruth in our Bible and her relationship with her mother-in-law, Naomi. And at one point, Naomi was going through such a difficult time that she said to Ruth, "Do not call me Naomi." It means sweetness. "Call me Marah, for the Almighty has caused me great grief and bitterness." She felt like Jim Carrey. And she said, "I'm changing my name from Naomi to Marah." I think the first thing that I would see from their stopping at Marah is this principle. We want to embrace that life includes bitterness, even for Christians. Marah is along the path, and it is bitter. My advice for you is fabrication does not help frustration. Pretending that salty water is sweet doesn't make it sweet, and it certainly doesn't satisfy the deeper reality of a need for a genuine drink of pure water. Now, I'm not saying we just endlessly grumble like the Israelites, but I do say we need to march with our eyes wide open and acknowledge whenever there is a Marah right in front of us. Acknowledge it. And did you notice as we read the text, and I quote Dr. Durham, their complaint serves as the trigger of God's provision of a solution to their problem. He responded to their problem because they faced the reality in front of them and they said, this is Marah and it stinks and I hate it. So we want to acknowledge that reality. But we don't stop there. We don't want to get mired in that negative mud, because the second thing that stands out to me here is that God does not exempt us from life's bitter realities, but he does work to transform them. Verse 25 says, Moses cried out to the Lord, and the Lord showed him a piece of wood. He threw it into the water, and the water became sweet. When he faced the reality that they were at a Marah, Moses asked for a solution, and God responded by guiding him to a tree. So we don't want to, again, just endlessly grumble and complain, but we want to use our energy when we face a Marah to cry out to God and say, Lord, I am desperate. I am going under for the third time if you don't do something. I need a miracle. I'm in a bitter situation, whether it's my job or my finances or a relationship or an illness or a wayward family member. We want to cry out. But here's where it gets tricky. Many times when we cry out, his power and grace actually change the situation. A miracle, as it were, happens. Unsolicited money shows up in the mail. The unsaved loved one gives his heart to Jesus. The shredded marriage is mended. The cancer is healed. We never want to forget that we serve a God of miracles. And when we're faced with a Marah-like situation, we want to fall on our face and we want to pound on heaven's door for transformation of the situation, for a miracle. And we want to do it for however long it takes. But sometimes, Marah never changes. And that's when we realize that the transformation God wants to do might be in me rather than in the situation. God can always be trusted to work transformation in me, even if the situation doesn't change. Now, there's an interesting detail in the text we read. It's in verse 26. I'm intrigued by it. It says, listen carefully to the Lord your God. I'm the Lord who heals you. Now, the reason that intrigues me is because the people never asked for healing. It was not on their mind. They were simply grumbling because they didn't have anything to drink, and all they wanted was fresh water. They weren't asking for healing. But when God heals the bitter water, he uses it to talk about healing in a bigger picture. And he uses a word that refers to physical, relational, emotional, spiritual healing of our hearts, our minds, and our attitudes. Why? Because he knows that in all the Marahs of life, even if they're not changed, we can be transformed, matured, and changed so that we are healthier in our journey in life. One of my pastors, when I was a young man, said, quote, the healing transformation of the bitter water illustrated the grace of God to cure bitter personalities. I can always count on God to bring transformation in me, even if he chooses not to bring transformation to the Marah situation itself. Now that brings me to our final principle. The Marahs of life get transformed by the cross. What do I mean by that? Now, I want to be integrous to the text. After all, we're tied to a Bible college, so we should probably handle our Bible fairly well. We are not told, I will admit, whether the tree purified the water by some sort of a chemical reaction, or the tree was just a symbol and it was of God's power at work in the situation, much like Moses' staff was in the confrontation with Pharaoh. And I don't want us to get fanciful and weird and make every reference in the Bible to a piece of wood to be a symbol of the cross. But I do know this. The transformation of their Marah water was by the power of God. And the New Testament makes it clear that God uses the cross of Jesus Christ to demonstrate his power. We are told that God made a public spectacle of the powers and authorities, triumphing over them by the cross. When we ask Jesus into our lives and follow him in committed discipleship through thick and thin, with lives that are anchored in prayer and worship, in submission to his will, in humble obedience, and in trust to the one who died for us, we will see God bring transformation by the cross of Jesus Christ, sometimes to the situation itself, but always to me and you as individuals. Close with a story. It was just before Memorial Day in 1999 when I picked up the phone and called my supervisor and resigned as the lead pastor of Faith Bible Center in Medford, Oregon. Like every good husband, I did it without telling my wife. Hey, I'd slept on the couch before. What was it again? The supervisor tried to talk me out of it, but I knew I had to do it. We negotiated 3 months. August 31st, 1999 would be the end date. This decision had been a long time coming in my own heart, and I knew I just needed to do it. And as crazy as it sounds, I knew God was leading me to do it, and he was leading me not only to resign my lead pastor position there, but not to look for another lead pastor position as one normally would, but to look for something different. But there was a problem. I had no backup plan. We had no nest egg in the bank. I had no marketable skills outside of teaching or pastoring. Was I going to sell cars? Was I going to sell insurance? What was I going to do? Well, the first thing I did was the only thing I knew to do. I sent 3 letters to 3 different churches in the Northwest, asking them if they would like to hire an experienced and incredibly brilliant pastor to be their executive pastor. Then I started cleaning out my file cabinets. Then the panic set in. God leading or no God leading, I thought, oh my gosh, I'm at Marah and I cannot find a piece of wood anywhere. I didn't hear a word from any of those 3 churches for weeks. Some days I would clean out my file cabinets, as I said. Other days I went home. I would lie on the den floor with the drapes shut, watch Oprah, while my wife was at work and our son was at school. My stomach was churning, and at times I actually felt vomit in my throat. How would I look homeless with everything I own in a shopping cart? True, I probably could have afforded to lose a few pounds, but emaciated, not a good look for me. Then I recalled the stop at Marah, and I thought, dang, I better start practicing what I preach. Put a pin in the story for a moment, would you? And we'll come back after we hear this song.
Every time I try to make it on my own, Every time I try to stand, I start to fall. And all those lonely roads that I have traveled on, there was Jesus. When the life I built came crashing to the ground, when my friends I had were nowhere to be found, I couldn't see it then, but I could see it now. There was Jesus. In the waiting, in the searching, in the healing and the hurting, like a blessing buried in the broken pieces. Every minute, every moment, where I've been and where I'm going, even when I didn't know it, I couldn't see it, there was Jesus. For this man who made amazing kind of grace, for forgiveness at a price I couldn't pay. I'm not perfect, so I thank God every day. There was Jesus. There was Jesus. In the waiting, in the searching, in the healing and the hurting, like a blessing buried in the broken pieces. Every minute, every moment, where I've been and where I'm going, even when I didn't know it, I couldn't see it. There was Jesus on the mountain, in the valley. There was Jesus in the shadow of the alley. Oh, there was Jesus in the fire, in the floods. There was Jesus, always is and always was. No, I'll never walk alone. You're always there. In the waiting, in the searching, in the healing and the hurting, like a blessing buried in the broken pieces. Every minute, every moment, where I've been and where I'm going, even when I didn't know it, I couldn't see it. There was Jesus. There was Jesus. There was Jesus. There was Jesus.
A story of two endings as we finish this morning. My story. Probably give myself a C, C minus for how I did going through that series of events. But I'll give God an A plus because the cross came through. A dream ministry position opened up in Montana that I started the day after I was finished in Medford. I didn't miss one paycheck. For me and my family, God actually transformed the situation. He transformed the circumstance. And we continue to live in the benefit of it today. Pam's situation was obviously different. Her husband and two sons died despite fasting, prayer, and faith. But there was still transformation. I called her and talked to her a couple of weeks ago. And she reminded me how through all of this, she has experienced God's tender mercies over and over and over again. She said the desperation of her Marah situation deepened her intimacy with God. And even beyond that, God has enabled her to lead a ministry called Grief Share, where nearly 1,000 people have experienced healing from the loss of grief through the ministry of her story and God's transforming work in her. This is Pam and her son Andrew today. He is the father of 3 incredible girls. From Marah to maturity, I can assure you that there was always Jesus.